Week, retired military, gainfully unemployed.
I'm Richard Luterio. I'm a retired insurance broker and now kind of a liberty activist and writer.
Randy Lennon, maintenance planner at the power plant.
Paul Anderson, retired physician.
Robert Miller, systems administrator for Verizon Wireless.
Maria Kotlanicki, I have my own business. I'm a hairdresser.
Ann Shepard, I work as an emergency medicine nurse.
Okay. Now, Karen, could you come up and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're doing, your latest venture?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I sure appreciate you all being here. I am running for County Commissioner, District 3 against Sally Clark. I'm a conservative Republican. My husband and I have lived in the county for about 30 years. We've raised our 7 kids in the county, been married 39 years. When our children were young, we had to really struggle financially because I had given up my career as a public school teacher and my husband was into youth work, which was not a high-paying kind of salary. So we learned how to stretch a dollar pretty thin. But those were good years. They were happy years. We loved that time with our kids. But we had a dream. And our dream was to pull ourselves back up with the American dream. We can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we can make something more. So when my husband left the youth work, we since then started 4 businesses. We have an excavation business, vacation rental, dance exercise studio, and land development. And we couldn't afford to buy homes, so we built our own. So we built 4 family residences as the general contractor and the laborers. And we now, we have started a nonprofit where we now take in men into our home to help them figure out how to live life a little bit more successfully after prison than they did before. But lest you think it sounds like some great success story, let me tell you about a black child that we adopted who'd been the victim of severe abuse. And in all our years of caring for him, he never could turn the corner. And so he is now struggling to make life work. So I know business and I know struggle. And that's what I would like to bring to working in the County Commissioner's office. And I understand that my opponent is describing me as just the angry housewife. And I think she's kind of right. I think we deserve better. And it's not a personal vendetta. But we deserve a government, a county government, where integrity is a rock-solid, basic moral foundation. And when I look at how that ballot initiative was written, something was missing there in integrity if half of the voters or majority of the voters could not figure that out. Should have been written differently. And then we could have brought it back before at our last election there, just last month. But they said, oh, it cost 24 cents a citizen, and that was too much money to spend. So my opponent now gets to run for her 3rd term. I just think integrity needs to be brought back. And I think we deserve a government where regulations are not stifling business. We, in one of our business struggles, we went through a process. We had to get county approval. Should have taken a month or 2, according to our attorney. Almost 3 years later, we finally got the approval. And that not only cost us thousands upon thousands, we paid those bureaucrats. Our tax money kept them going those 3 years to fight us. And I believe that we just need to get back to smaller government where indebtedness is not hidden. And with the COP, certificates of participation, the amount of indebtedness that we are uncovering is scary. And so I would like to see it brought back. Where was the last vote that we had when huge amounts of capital expenditures were incurred by our county government?
Never.
It's been a long time, hasn't it, Brad? And it needs to be brought back with this. We have a chance to vote on it. So, here's the angry housewife, and I am asking for your support. Some of you believe in prayer. I do, and I would sure be grateful for those of you who pray. Some of you may have the finances to help just keep the campaign going. Some of you may be willing to make phone calls or be the feet on the ground, or some of you may go to your caucus. And if you're in District 3, West Side, Manitou, all that whole West Side, I sure appreciate your support at caucus and at the county assembly. Thank you, Karen Magistrelli. Chuck.
One comment about Sally Clark, who's been in charge of Department of Human Services. She has utterly failed to regulate and reform that department, and that is a horror story for children, for parents, for anyone else that has to deal with the DHS.
We have seen that too. I appreciate that, Chuck. Yes.
And that is Sally Clark's responsibility.
I didn't know that. I'm glad to know that. I didn't know she was ahead of that. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, well, we're going to watch a video that's not part of Tom's presentation, but we got it on the screen. So I'm going to introduce Tom, we'll watch a video, and then we'll have Tom come up. Tom Ryan is a co-founder of the research office, co-founder and research officer for Analyst Strategy Group, LLC, with over 30 years experience in executive management, strategic consulting, and technology development and management. Tom spent almost 15 years providing strategic guidance to global financial services organizations, including and helping to define information strategies for Charles Schwab, Credit Suisse First Boston, JP Morgan Chase, and ANZ. Outside of financial services, as CIO of EchoStar Communications in the late 90s, Tom oversaw the operational infrastructure as a satellite television provider grew organically from a startup to over 2 million customers and $2 billion in revenue in under 3 years. As a director with KPMG Consulting, now Bearing Point, he was one of 5 individuals designated as market evangelists responsible for shifting global CXO perceptions of KPMG's capabilities in advance of the group's successful IPO. Tom holds an MBA from Regis University with emphasis in information systems. He holds undergraduate degrees in business and economics and is a recent graduate of the leadership program of the Rockies. So, please welcome Tom, and just know that this is something that Paul wants to see first, and then Tom's going to come speak. So.
Is economics professor at Valencia College down in Florida, Jack Chambliss. Jack, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. I understand on one of the first days of your class, which is predominantly sophomores, you asked the kids to get out, write a 10-minute essay on what the American dream means to them. And this year, the results were jaw-dropping. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, in addition to asking them what the American dream looks like for them, I then had them write specifically what they wanted the federal government to do to help them achieve that dream.
Great.
I took the essays from 3 classes, about 180 students, back to my office, and over the next day poured over them. About 10% of the students said that they wanted the government to leave them alone and not tax them too much and let them regulate their own lives. But over 80% of the students said that the American dream to them meant a house and a job and plenty of money for retirement and vacations and things like this. But when it came to the part about the federal government, 8 out of 10 students said that they wanted free health care, they wanted the government to pay for their tuition, they wanted the government to pay for the down payment on their house, they expected the government to, quote, give them a job. Many of them said that they wanted the government to tax wealthier individuals so that they would have an opportunity to have a better life.
Here, well, I tell you what, Jack, we've got a little snippet from one of the essays one of the kids wrote. As human beings, we are not really responsible for our own acts, and so we need government to control those who don't care about others. Now, as you describe it, where the kids said, you know, they want free college, they want down payment, free health care. Have they been watching? Do you feel that that is from this whole Occupy movement? They feel like they're part of the 99 and they want the 1% to give them the rest of their lives?
Well, this essay was written before the Occupy movement really took hold. So fundamentally, they had this belief before people in their cohort group took to the streets to demand the same sorts of things that they wrote that they expected in this essay that they wrote for me.
Well, where do you think this sense of entitlement comes from?
Well, certainly I think a big part of it comes from the public schools. When I start talking to my students over the semester and ask them how much time the public schools spend on the principles of John Locke or Adam Smith or Hayek or some of the other people who very clearly said that we have a God-given right to life, liberty, and property, but the government doesn't have a responsibility to provide things for us. When I ask them how much of this they learn in their classes, K through 12, they stare at me and they say, well, we've never heard these sorts of things. So the public schools are part of it. I do think that the last 20 years or so we've seen a growing sense of entitlement by the American people. As you probably have read, that we're in a situation now where 44% of the American people now are living off of some sort of government benefit compared to only 29% back in the early 80s. Right. And I also think the last 3 years of having a president that appealed to the younger generation by saying that somehow people who are wealthier are a problem for us, much like Franklin Roosevelt told people 70 years ago, and that these people somehow should be sending their money to others. I think this has really caught on with a lot of students, and they believe now that somehow the tooth fairy exists in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, dressed as Uncle Sam. Before you go, you got to tell me about the experiment you do in your class where you're essentially a pickpocket.
Well, yes. When I went back to class the next time to meet with them, I told them I'd read over their essays and I read some of the comments they had made. And then I set them on a table and I asked everybody to pull out their wallets and their purses. And I picked one student in each class, and when their wallet was in their hand, I grabbed their wallet out forcefully. And in one case, I grabbed a girl's purse and I rifled through her purse, pulled out her wallet, pulled out all of her cash. And I said that part of my American dream was to have a cabin in northern Minnesota someday so I could have a nice retirement, and that this money was now going to help fund that American dream. And of course that set in motion an explanation on why using the government to plunder people to support our American dream is fundamentally morally wrong, constitutionally wrong, and leads to a lot of economically bad events if we let that idea gain ground.
He's a professor of economics at Valencia College down in Florida. Jack, you better go back to class because you've got a lot of heads to fill.
I will keep trying. Thank you.
No kidding. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, so that's a heck of an act to try to follow, my gosh. That's pretty scary. That's pretty scary.
Tom, did you get the on switch?
Oh. Now I did? Okay. So first of all, thank you all for allowing me to speak with you here tonight. I also want to welcome those online that may be watching this via streaming and those that will watch it over the coming days and weeks as they download it off the Barbeque Economics Club website. The topic for tonight is what I call barbecue logic. Now, we've all been there. I know I've been there many, many times. You're at a party, you're at a family gathering, you're at a barbecue, you're at some kind of social event, and someone makes one of those statements that just fundamentally defies logic, defies common sense, defies any sense of reason. You know, something like, yeah, absolutely, the rich should pay higher taxes. They need to pay their fair share. Or, wow, the American economy would be so much better if we could just make stuff here again. If we just could get more of those high-paying manufacturing jobs. You don't have to go to a family gathering, just listen to Rick Santorum in the Republican debates and you'll get all of that nonsense you'd ever want. But they'll also make inane statements like, the United States and other developed countries are wealthy only because they've exploited third world countries. Or the domestic equivalent, the rich are getting richer and the poor are just being ignored. Well, unfortunately, in the past, far too often I took the bait. And I'd walk over to the group and I'd I'd say something like, well, actually a little bit of explanation. I'm an analytic kind of oriented person. So my whole orientation was, if you just knew what I know, if you just had the facts, you'd see the problems in your own logic. So again, I'd walk over and I'd say something like, so the rich are getting richer and the poor are just stagnating. Well, you know, a lot of the data that supports that comes from household income studies, which are just notorious for being corrupt or manipulated. The first thing we need to look at is how many full-time equivalent workers are there per household. And in fact, a lot of the statistics show that FTEs in the households of that bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, there's about 0.7 FTEs per household. Many households don't even have a single full-time worker in them. In contrast, the top fourth or the fifth quintiles up here, 2.6, 2.7 FTEs per household. That right there accounts for a 4x gap in the income. And that doesn't even begin to look at things like, well, what's their earnings potential based on their level of education that they've achieved? What's the impact of geographic differences as we look at cost of living and wage rates in different parts of the country? Doesn't account for industries and what industries people might work in. In fact, if we suddenly account for things like the number of workers, geographic distribution, level of education achieved, and so on, and a few other factors, well over 90% of this so-called income gap completely disappears. Now, be honest, how many of you were going through your mind, yeah, that's right, yep, that's check, 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 check. Here's the problem. About halfway through that explanation, 2 or 3 people just kind of walked away. Those that still remain, they're just completely glazed over. I mean, you could go like this and they wouldn't even blink. And after a pregnant pause, somebody probably says something like, how about them Broncos? And the whole topic gets changed, right? So clearly I was affected. It was so bad that coming home from a Christmas party a couple of years ago, my wife looks at me in the car and she says, are you deliberately trying to get people not to like you? We were at a barbecue literally just this last summer at the beginning of the season, and I heard one of those inane comments from somewhere, and I turned around and it hit me. My wife's gaze. And it was this mix of, oh, please don't, and don't you dare. I smiled and I walked right over to the group and I said, how about them Broncos? Because that's what we do. We tend to have two choices here. Most of us here are more analytical by orientation, and we think if people just knew the facts, they could see the light, they'd know the truth. So we're going to give them those facts. The other choice is we just munch down on the hamburger and get a little indigestion and just ignore the whole thing. But on the drive home, my wife reminded me of something Abraham Lincoln wrote in his autobiography. Not Abraham Lincoln, excuse me. Benjamin Franklin wrote in his autobiography. And he said, when he was younger, he was quite disputatious. I love that word, disputatious. He liked to argue. He liked to debate. He wanted to win the dang argument. He said, in later life, I came to realize that it was far more important to change minds than to win the argument. And that's what we have to do here. If we're going to evangelize the principles of Austrian economics, if we're going to evangelize the principles of freedom, we have to know and have some strategies for how to change minds. Well, there's some things we're going to have to know to be able to do that. One of the first things, we got to know, so why does economics matter? Why is it so important? We got to be able to know who it is that we're talking to, who it is that we're trying to explain something to. We need to make darn sure that we can understand and rationalize our own principles to distill out what the bedrock principles are that are going to provide the basis for any of our discussions with people. And then lastly, again, for me, I'm analytical in nature. I need to have that list. So what are some guidelines? What are some principles? What are some rules that I can apply and just keep in my mind just to be ready to talk with people whenever I run into those situations? Well, on this first topic of why is economics important, sometimes humor helps. And so we can do things like, oh, economics is extremely useful as a form of employment for economists. Sometimes that'll get a little laugh, and people will go, yeah, that makes sense. Other times, we'll say something like, the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. Again, we want to use some humor just to kind of break the ice. And I love, this guy's a little off color in his humor, but I love this comment. And I know this happens because I took economics, and I'd explain it to you, except I flunked that course in college. If ignorance paid dividends, most Americans can make a fortune out of what they don't know about economics. I love Thomas Sowell. One of the first lessons of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to fully satisfy those who want it. First lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. But, no matter how much we go through and just kind of break the ice, ultimately, we fall into a trap. I always do. I come back to some kind of an explanation like Llewellyn Rockwell from the Foundation for Economic Education, and I'll start to give a very academic answer. Why does economics matter? Well, because it really deals with the entire deposit of scarce physical and intellectual resources. We've got to figure out how are these allocated in a way that's sustainable and maximum goods and so on. People glaze over. We may find that really fascinating, even if we go to the route of von Mises and say, no, this really has to do more with human action. It's about people. It's about people interacting. You try to give them an explanation like this, and you use a word like praxeology, and again, they're just going to glaze over. What the heck is that? So we need to understand who people are so that we can then position how we're going to talk with those people, how we're going to talk with them. There's been a lot of work done on a model that actually divides the American population into 5 core groups. Now, you only see 4 up there. I'll explain that in a minute. But 5 core groups. The first one is what we call the religious right. Very faith-based in the way they approach the world. And what they care about is life, marriage, stewardship, those type of values. The next group are what we call the flags. They're the right and wrong, law and order, defense, immigration, crime. Everything is black and white. It's cut and dried, and it's patriotic, do or die. The third group are what's commonly referred to as the pocketbook voters, or the economists. They care about economy, spending, taxes, something to do with money. And the last category down here are the hearts. The folks that care about education, environment, health care. These are the soccer moms right here. That's that group. Now, the 5th group is actually represented by an equal sign. They're what I refer to as the lunatic egalitarians that care about equality for the sake of equality. They're so far gone that I don't think there's any hope of reaching them. And that's why I only put the first 4 up here. But what's their orientation? Paul Prentice often talks about if you go up to someone and say, well, what do you think about such and such? And they respond with, well, I feel. All of a sudden, they've changed thinking to feeling. As soon as you hear that word feel, you can start to think, oh, they're a heart or they're a cross, because those are the categories that tend to be very feeling or emotionally based. Now, there can be liberals and conservative hearts. There can be liberals and conservative crosses. This isn't saying these are always the right and these are, as you go this way, you get more left. That's why I put them in a column rather than horizontally, because each of these categories can break either way. But the crosses and the hearts tend to orient from a feelings perspective. The dollar signs, this is where I sit. I spent over a year trying to even figure out how these people address the world. I couldn't break out of my own paradigm. And when I started to think about, well, how would a heart look at this issue? I'd come up with something and my wife would go, no, you're still talking economics. You're still talking dollars and cents. Well, how would I feel if I lost my job? She says, no, a job is an economic issue. Stop. Don't talk about it. Just stop with how would I feel and end it. But same kind of thing. The defense or immigration people are very principles oriented. Again, it's right, wrong, and so on. Any guesses on what the distribution of the population is? What group do you think constitutes the largest single group in the United States? Hearts? Flags, okay. Well, that's the way it breaks down. The hearts by far are the largest single group. Now, this is a problem because if you think of most liberty groups, Tea Party groups, who do they appeal to? Flags. Go to their websites and look at what their messages are. Look at how they talk about things, and it's all flags. That means on a really, really good day, they're going to reach 21% of the population. They got to figure out how to break out of that mindset and talk to other people, or the liberty movement's never going to have any ground. The Liberty 912 organizations start to pull in and pull in more of the religious aspects of the situation. But even there, on a really good day, they're dealing with only a third of the population. We here at Barbeque Economics Club, we talk numbers and dollars and cents, and that's what makes the world go round. Problem is, on our best day, we're going to reach less than a quarter of the population. We've got to figure out how to talk the values of different people, or we're never going to make any headway in changing minds. So what does that look like? Why does economics matter? If you're talking to a cross-oriented people, you can say things like, poor people can't help others. Okay? You can say something like, economics is really just, stewardship is really just applied economics. Christ didn't preach a doctrine of sacrifice yourself completely. He preached love others as we love ourselves. That part of that sentence is loving ourselves. We've got to take care of ourselves. And we must respect the dignity and the honor of each person. And if you start thinking about things from dignity and honor, and you start looking at some of the policies or some of the actions that our government at the county, state, and federal level are taking, it fundamentally denies the dignity of the person. So that starts to give us a clue as to how we might shape a discussion if we're talking to someone who's across. Yeah?
Define that first sentence, where people can't help others. What do you mean by that?
It's actually stolen from Dave Ramsey from Financial Peace University, but one of the things that he talks about is that if I don't have a job, if I'm not producing and I'm getting paid and making sufficient money, then I don't have the means or the capability of going and helping other people. I can't donate food or money or clothing to the poor if I don't have food or money and clothing to donate, to give to others. So if I'm on the receiving end, then I have a real hard time turning around and helping those around me with food, clothing, or dollars.
I understand that. I don't mean to be argumentative and mess up your time frame. But shouldn't that sentence be down in the dollar category rather than up in the faith category?
No, because the reason why I put it up here is because the faith category is very much about charitable works, charitable caring, helping others, caring for the poor, caring for those less advantaged. And the point is that we try to make there is simply that you can't do that if you're broke. So yeah, there's a...
Between the two, how can
yeah.
the next category talk to the... How can the dollar sign category talk to the hearts?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Flags. Can America defend American values? American values. Is our country at risk from all our borrowing, debt, and spending? Again, yeah, it's tying in some of the dollars here, but what happens to America in a global in a global economy. America's standing in the world is fading. So yeah, economics matters because we are talking about dollars and cents here, but it matters because of America's standing. It matters because we have to be strong to be able to defend our values. It matters because we need to participate in the global economy, and so on. The economists are easy. Will we default on our debt? Are we headed for hyperinflation? What role should government play in managing the economy? How do I protect my retirement savings? Anything very core, just start to finish, having to do with dollars and cents, applies to the economic piece. The soccer moms are, how will you feel, not if you lose your job, but how will you feel if you can't feed your family? How frightened will you be if you or your spouse is laid off? I know that starts to get into the job thing like I mentioned earlier, but if you just say feel, that's not powerful enough. But if you say how frightened, the emotion of fright takes over. Why don't more people care about the environment? We need to get more people caring about the environment. And will Social Security and Medicare be there to take care of me as I get older? Now, an example of this was actually a car commercial I saw a year ago, 9 months ago. They have some electric car coming out. And in one 30-second commercial, they said, you need to buy this car because it's good for the environment. It reduces pollution and helps the environment. By the way, it allows you to drive past the gas pump, so it's going to save money and keep dollars in your pocket by driving this electric vehicle. It reduces our dependence on foreign oil so our soldiers won't have to be fighting overseas. And fundamentally, it's all about stewardship of the resources that we've been given. One 30-second commercial, bam, 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 bam. They hit all four categories. When they focus group tested that commercial, before it went on air, it was the single highest scoring ad they had ever seen, and it didn't matter what the makeup of the group was. They didn't care, are we bringing in soccer moms and we're targeting this ad to soccer moms? Are we bringing in, a bunch of college students? It didn't matter. No matter who they brought in, had a positive response because in 30 seconds they had something that hit every single category.
Did the car sell?
That's a different question. That's a different question. They actually generated a lot of interest, and there was a lot of impact of people going to the dealership. But the purpose of an ad is to get people to go to the dealership, and from that perspective, it was very successful. In terms of closing the sale, no, because there was a million other things that got that sidetracked it.
Like price.
Yeah, like price.
Well, and Chevy Volt's catching fire too.
Well, that's only more recently that's come out. Of course, if you want, you can always go to the old standby. I don't care if it's a heart, a cross, a dollar sign, a flag. Children. Why does economics matter? Because failure leads to taxing the unborn. Failure leads to condemning our children to perpetual poverty. Failure to address the economic and to understand the economic issues is going to sell our children into slavery. Now, this is playing hardball. You do this as a last resort. This is to the person that you try to figure out who they are, you try to shape your position, and it's just not getting through. Then you pull out the 2x4 to the side of the head. But if you do this, you better be prepared for the reaction because people will jump on it, and then you got to be able to follow it up and go back to a more detailed argument or a more detailed position based on hearts and crosses and dollars and so on. So I want to take a little bit of a detour here then and say, okay, well, if we have this model, this idea of crosses and flags and dollars and hearts, and we're going to go out and try to shape our position around there, the next question is, well, what are the fundamental principles that we need to draw on? We can't just go talk to these folks. We've got to have a foundation to draw from. I want to talk for a minute about economic schools, which for many in here, we'll go through it pretty quick. And then I want to go through an explanation of why I think the Austrians have it right. But this is important. This Austrians have it right is important because it will tease apart a lot of the secondary things that we tend to look at as Austrian economists and really peel it back and make sure that we're focusing on the core when we go out and shape our arguments. And then we'll do some practical application here. So the problem with economic schools, if you will, or the framework, is we got everything from Keynesians to new Keynesians. We got all kinds of formulas. We got classics, new classicals. We end up with, I should go to some more here, supply-siders, monetarists, rational expectations theory, public choice, experimentalists, and Austrians, and so on. The bottom line is, oh my gosh, where do we start? Well, fundamentally, we can say that there's three schools of economic thought. And even for those of you that know this stuff cold, I'm hoping maybe this will give you a real simple, straightforward paradigm to think about this stuff, maybe in a little more clearly, or think about it a little more clearly. With each school, we want to talk about the goal. What are they trying to accomplish? What's their main concern? Who's the actor? What's the mechanism by which this stuff is happening? And how do they figure out what it is they're going to do? And what kind of education? The reason this one is in there is because I went out and I surveyed, literally I had my little camera, haven't produced it into the film yet. I was going to put it at the beginning, but haven't gotten that far yet. I videotaped people at Park Meadows Mall in southern Denver area there. I did it at the Castle Rock outlet stores. I went to a Southlands Mall out in Aurora. And I asked people, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word economics? And a lot of, not to go into details, but the most important thing that I think that came out of that is universally people said, oh, that's really complicated stuff. Oh, you got to have a PhD to understand that. Oh my, this is really intense things. So what's the level of education required to understand this stuff? If we look at the London School, the purpose or the goal is to control and manage the economy. It's that simple. Their main concern, they focus on business cycles and employment. Who's the actor? Government. The driver is fiscal policy. The mechanism is spending and taxing. Guidance, so that we know what to do, the guidance is provided by complex mathematical models. Oh my gosh, I mean, one of my undergraduates is in economics. At one point I had this stupid notion that I was going to go back and get a PhD in economics, and I looked up at Boulder, and I got within about 10 credits of finishing a degree in electrical engineering before I jumped over into business. And so I've had all the calculus and differential equations and math up the wazoo. And I didn't have near the math that they wanted me to have to even get in the door to take my first class at a PhD level, at a 500 or 600 level at CU's School of Economics. So, oh my gosh, these mathematical models are horribly complex. So it's no wonder you got to have a PhD. The Chicago School.
Excuse me.
Yes.
London School is Keynesian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chicago School, monetarists. Okay, Chicago School, control and manage the economy. But now we're going to pay attention to inflation. It's all about inflation and price stability. So we're going to act through the Federal Reserve with monetary policy, and we're going to adjust interest rates and currency in order to manage inflation and keep prices stable within the economy. Again, horribly complex mathematical models, and a PhD is required to make sense of all this stuff. Now, it's important to note that both the London and Chicago schools share three things. The goal of controlling and managing the economy, plus the guidance is provided by these complex models, and you better have a PhD to understand what's going on. If we contrast that with the Austrians aren't about controlling. They're not about managing the economy. They're about individual liberty and maximizing production. The main concern isn't business cycles and inflation and price stability. It's about private property. It's about market pricing. The actor isn't the government or the Federal Reserve, it's you, it's me, it's all the individuals. The driver isn't policy, it's human behavior. It's how do rational, normal people act day to day living their lives. The mechanism isn't spending and taxing that's driven by these complex models and so on. It's free trade. Let people do what people do. Free trade, entrepreneurship. And there's no math. I've spoken at high schools and I say, you sitting in your desk are a better economist than John Kenneth Galbraith. You sitting in your desk are a far better economist than Alan Meltzer. Why? Because you haven't obfuscated the problem with trying to create some complex mathematical formula. You understand relationships. When I go out to buy something, if I value what I'm buying more than the cash in my pocket, I buy it. If I don't buy it. It's that simple. All you have to know is how do people respond to each other in a society that protects private property. That's all Austrian economics is all about. And therefore, what education is required? I don't know, if you have common sense. You don't need a complex degree. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. In the London school, the Keynesian school, what is the role of government? It's to flatten the business cycle. Business cycles go like this. Keynesian theory says, no, we need to make it go like this. We need to flatten that. So what do? During the low, we're going to pump up government spending to try to push it up. When it gets going too fast, we're going to raise taxes. So it pulls it back down. The whole point is to maintain high employment by stimulating demand. Jobs, jobs, jobs. We've got to have a stimulus program. That's a Keynesian response. Well, what's the role of the person? What's the role of you as an individual? Your job, according to the Keynesian model, is to spend and consume. We're a consumption economy. And in fact, if you don't have enough cash in your pocket to spend and consume, it is your obligation to go borrow money. Go into debt so that you can maintain your level of spending and consuming. In fact, if you don't do it, the government will do it for you. We'll borrow on your behalf so that we can spend and consume. Avoid savings and investing. Because if you save and invest, you're a rentier. You're stealing money from people when you're not really doing anything. So spend and consume. What's the history of this? It was the de facto policy from the FDR era up till about the 1970s, almost worldwide. In the late 70s, there was this little problem. Keynesian theory couldn't explain high inflation and high unemployment. So people started saying the model's broken, all these complex mathematical formulas aren't working, so let's fall to something else, and they ended up going to monetary policy. But there was a rebirth and resurgence with all these government bailouts. Oh, we've got a problem, we're not spending and consuming enough, so let's stimulate the economy. So Keynesian theory has been coming back in force since about 2007. How about the Chicago School, the monetarists? In this case, the role of government is to coordinate monetary policy through and with the Federal Reserve so that we manage and control inflation to a target rate. How many times have you heard it come out and say, we want inflation this year to be about 1.6%, or we want to keep inflation under 2%? The whole focus, that's what monetarists talking. It's all about how do we manage or control this rate of inflation, and how do we control GDP growth? So we don't grow too fast, but we don't grow too slow. Again, though, what's your role within the monetarist school? It's to spend and consume. It's to borrow, to maintain liquidity, avoid savings and investing. Now, the monetarist school really displaced Keynesian theory in the late 70s And it did. It conquered inflation. It had an answer for the 80s and 90s to drive down inflation. But it started losing favor. I mean, when your discount rate that the Fed is charging is already zero, where do you go from there? How do you get things going again when all the bullets in your gun have already been shot? Offers no opportunity. Well, let's look at the Austrian school. Every liberty group, every 912, every person that has ever read the Constitution should jump up and say, I'm an Austrian economist. Because the first thing the Austrians say is the role of government is to protect and ensure individual natural rights. Remember, Austrians are all about private property, private ownership. Government's job is to protect that. Have to have then an independent judiciary to enforce a contract, which is a property right. Got to have a stable currency. Got to have government intervention. This is an interesting comment. Von Mises said it. A government intervention in the market process is always and everywhere destructive. So the role of government is to stay out of the way. But what's your job as an individual? Very different. It's not about spending and consuming and borrowing and so on. Your job as an individual is to produce. It's interesting that both the London and the Chicago school make this assumption that you're going to go spend and you're going to go consume, but what you're spending on and consuming just kind of magically materializes out of the ether. It'll just be there. Austrians say, no, let's get things in the right order here. Before you can buy anything, you have to produce something. You have to produce. And if your focus is on production, then your next focus is going to be on innovation and taking risks. Because if your job is to produce, you got to get better. You got to do it faster. You got to do it easier. As a real quick side note, I mentioned earlier the inane comment about, oh, if we could just get back our manufacturing jobs. At the turn of the century in 1900, 85% of the U.S. population was engaged in farming. Today, 3% is engaged in farming. Are we all starving? The U.S. is producing more food now than it has at any time in its history because the individual farmer, the individual worker got more productive. In 2007, constant dollar value, some formulas to normalize things, but the constant dollar value of manufactured goods produced in the United States was the highest it's ever been. Now, it's come down a little bit with the recession, but in 2007, we made stuff in the United States. We made more stuff than we have ever made in the history of the country. But the number of workers employed in manufacturing went from 36% in the late 1960s down to about 9% today. The same people that are saying we'd be better off if we just could get back those good manufacturing jobs are the same people who in the 1940s were going, the economy would get going if we just had more farmers. If we could just outlaw combines, if we could get everybody out there picking that cotton by hand, everybody'd have a job. To heck with having the machine go down and pick the corn. We want people out there ripping those ears off the stalks. It's the same mentality. We innovate, we produce, and we produce better and faster. And we save and invest. The thing here is that the history, it was central of Austrian schools, very central to price theory over in Europe, in Austria. All the debates around socialism and so on in the late 1800s, Austrian thinking was front and center. But it fell into the background in the 30s and the 70s as everybody was in a panic, and FDR and first Hoover and then FDR convinced everybody that what we really need to do is spend more money. There was a mild resurgence in the late 70s, again, kind of with monetary theory when Keynesian theory fell into disrepute. But there's an increasing interest today due to the failure of both the London and the Chicago schools. And there's an increasing interest today because it aligns with the liberty movement. And lastly, there's an interest in it today because it aligns with this thing called complexity theory that we've only started to understand in the last 15 years. But to keep it in mind, I was going to do a game with you guys, but we're not going to have time. I was going to say, who does he belong to? Well, Keynes obviously goes in the London school. Milton Friedman is the Chicago school. Galbraith is the London school.
Austrian.
Our hero Ludwig is Austrian. Friedrich goes to the Austrian school. Why is that not? There we go. Marie Rothbard, Austrian. Anna Schwartz. You guys know who she is?
Yes, Chicago School.
Yep, she co-wrote with Milton Friedman all the treatises on monetary policy. Alan Meltzer falls in that category. Robert Reich. Communist? Close. But we'll put him in the London school. Leonard Reed? Have you ever read I Pencil? Okay. Austrian. Don Boudreau. You guys ever Cafe Hayek or any of those? Henry Hazlitt. Paul Krugman. Barack Obama. Marxist, but falling here. Greenspan, Chicago. Volcker, Chicago. Bernanke. Notice anything about, I wonder why all the Fed chairmen fall into the school that uses the Federal Reserve as the main mechanism for the economy, and why all these government folks, all these presidents and folks believe the government is the rule and the way to solve the problems. But the bottom line is, if people are talking about government, I mean, in some ways, liberals have it so easy. They wake up every morning knowing that the answer is government. They just haven't been asked the question yet. So, government is the answer to everything. Spending and taxing is the way we're going to do it. Chicago School, the Federal Reserve is the answer to everything, and we're going to do it through interest rates and currency. In the Austrian school, it's all about people, and it's about free trade. Now, so which school has it right? Austrians. Why? I mentioned this thing called complexity. And we'll go through this pretty quick, but we tend to think of the world if A, then B. There's whole college courses on logic. If A, then B. That's the way we live our lives. If A, then B. In fact, we can get a little fancier and say if A, then B, if B, then C. Well, therefore, if A, then C. And we can go all the way to if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then D, if A, then D. We think of the world, most people think of the world in these cause-effect, linear type of relationships. Here's the problem. That's a simplified version of reality. And you're going to come into this and say, well, if A, then D? I don't think so. One way to think of this, the way I explain it to people, so I'll say, imagine you're at your local pool hall and somebody says, I need you to put that cue ball in the corner pocket. I'm not a good shot. That's why I put 95% instead of 100. But most people probably could hit one ball into the corner pocket. But what if you say, no, you got to hit the one ball. One is yellow, right? Okay, you got to hit the one ball into the corner pocket. Well, now the odds go down a little bit. But what if I got to hit the one ball into the 3 ball into the 5 ball, no, 2 ball into the 7, if I got the colors right. That's maybe a trick shot that some professional is going to try to set up and make. That's not something I'm going to attempt on a day-to-day basis. So why, when we think about things going on in the economy, do we say, well, if I put some stimulus in here, it's going to cause this, 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 and boom, GDP is going to go up 4%. It doesn't happen. There's too many variables in the path. Complexity rears its ugly head. There's another problem. We've always thought about if A then B. That's a very Newtonian way of looking at the world. Quantum physics has taught us there is no such thing as if A then B. What there is if A, then there's a probability of B. Now, maybe that probability of B is 99.999%, and so we don't want to think about it that complexly, so we just take the shorthand as if A then B, and we assume that it's 100%. But the problem is, when we throw out the recognition that this stuff is only a probability and not an absolute, we start to miss the ball. If A then B is only 80% probable, in only 3 interactions, the probability of a desired outcome drops to 50-50. If probability is 99%, it only takes 70 interactions for that accumulated probability to go down to 50-50. Now, what does that say in the United States economy? What's the probability that stimulus A will produce a desired outcome B when we're talking about millions of actors and billions of interactions, even assuming a 99.999% interactional probability? People wonder about unintended consequences. You have no control. There is no cause and effect in a complex system. It 100% breaks down. At the one level of interaction, I can say if A, then there's an 80% probability of B. But as soon as I go 3 levels out, if A, well, B's 50-50. It breaks down. It's non-predictive. And that doesn't account, that's saying 80% probability, 99% probability. But in an economy, we're talking about people. And people are impulsive. People are irrational. People have delayed response. You tell them something today, and a week later they do something, or 2 months later they do something after they've thought about it for a while, talked it over with their spouse, talked it over with friends at work. There's delayed responses. I love Adam Smith. Man is dominated by self-love, but not without some concern for others. He's able to reason, but not necessarily in such a way as to reach the right conclusion. And he's seeing the outcomes of his action, but through a veil of self-delusion. So we think we're going to insert a stimulus into a complex systems of millions of people with billions of interactions, each one of those dealing with people who are impulsive, irrational, and delayed response, and we think we can predict what the outcome is going to be. We also think of things linearly. Mary's going to talk to Joe, who's going to talk to Sam, who's going to talk to Susie. But the reality is that Mary talks to Joe, and Joe talks to Sally, and Sally talks to Mary, and it sets up this positive feedback loop, and maybe Mary does even more, and it just starts going and growing. Now A is both the cause and the effect of itself. But John over here talks to Sam, Sam talks to Susie, Susie talks to this person, and this person goes back to John and says, I'm not sure about this. You know, maybe for Mary over here, that's the right answer, but for you, I don't think so. So it now sets up a negative feedback loop. So what's the impact of Mary going to have over here on Susie when this one is running this way and this one is trying to put on the brakes? And ultimately, we end up with situations where this last person goes back and talks to Mary and says, you know, there's some problems with what you're trying to tell me or what you're trying to convince me to do, and there's a negative feedback loop. So now we got a situation where A is both the cause and effect of itself, and A is a governor on itself. How do I have any clue of what's going to happen in a complex system by pushing a stimulus into it?
Well, one of the ways Keynesians do it is they purposely leave out elements that they don't want to consider so they can prove their predicted results.
Oh, absolutely. Look at any Keynesian formula and look at the lists of all other things being equal down at the bottom. It gives you the list of all the things they've excluded from the complexity of reality in the hopes that they can have a formula that says something that they like.
And then when the formula fails, they say, well, it was an unforeseen circumstances because all other things were not.
Yeah, so one of these, all other things being equal, really wasn't. So give me another grant and I'll go adjust my formula. But complexity also, the most insidious problem with complexity is the illusion of 20/20 hindsight. Why did we get into the economic crisis that we have right now? Oh, it's because these greedy bankers back here were setting up all these credit default swaps and security-backed instruments or mortgage-backed securities and so on. That's what caused the problem. Other people, oh, no. It was Congress. Congress passed all these equal housing laws, and Congress passed this bill, and Congress passed this bill. Congress is the one who caused the problem. Somebody else comes along and says, well, yeah, I kind of agree with you, but it really was driven by something else over here.
That would be Bush.
Yeah, it was caused by Bush. Okay. So the problem, the most insidious problem with any complex system is we can look at it and say, we can explain this. But we're explaining it, this is even worse than the Keynesians saying all other things being equal. We explain it in the form of a linear cause and effect, and we totally ignore the fact that there's all these other interactions and positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops and everything else going on in there. And lastly is the fallacy of the aggregates. We get, gross national product and gross national income. We get the trade deficit's my favorite one. I always tell people, if I write a book, because you got to have a book to be credible, but if I write a book and it's successful and a publisher over in Japan says, hey, I'd like to distribute your book in Japan. And I go, okay, fine. And I talk to the publisher here in the States, and we print up 20,000 copies, and we stick it on a boat or a plane, and we send it over to Japan, and they sell them. And I get paid $1 million. That counts when we're calculating the trade deficit. But what happens if the publisher over in Japan says, no, just sell me your intellectual rights, I'll take care of printing it and distributing it over here. And so I go click, 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 and I send him a copy of my book on the internet, and he prints it, and he sends me a check for $1 million. That $1 million never shows up in the trade deficit. It's never even considered in the calculation of the balance of trade. The amount of transactions that are, you talk about Keynesians, all of the things excluded, the dollars that are excluded from the calculation dwarf the actual calculations of when they're counting beans in terms of what's going abroad and what's coming back and so on. It's lunacy when we talk about creating any of these aggregates. Unemployment, how many people talk about unemployment? What's the real unemployment number? Well, it's 18%. No, it's 14%. Well, officially it's 8 point whatever. Consumer pricing index, aggregate pricing, multipliers, velocity, all these neat terms. They've reached into the economy and they've pulled out this and that, and they create this thing they call an aggregate, and they go, now this is predictive. We can use this in a formula that you have to have a PhD to understand in order to predict something that isn't going to happen, and then we'll blame it on the formula wasn't quite right, so give me another grant so I can adjust my formula. I mean, the lunacy of trying to go in and explain this stuff, I mean, aggregates are merely subjective observations. They have absolutely no predictive power. If Austrians had their way, the government would never collect another economic statistic. Yay. Again, when you talk to high schoolers, you say, you are a better economist than Alan Meltzer because Alan Meltzer wants to collect aggregates, and all you care about is the dollars in my hand worth more to me, or is that thing I want to buy worth more to me? That's the level that you need to understand things to be an economist. Complexity, I'm going to ignore this for a minute. The benefits of a complex system are it's adaptable, it's evolvable, resilient, boundless, and there's a lot of novelty. The disadvantages of any complex system are that it's non-optimized, and this drives people crazy. Oh, but there's so much inefficiency. Yeah, but I'll give up a little bit of inefficiency in order to have something that's adaptable, evolvable, resilient, and boundless, and novelty, boundless, continuously growing. It's non-controllable, it's non-predictable, it is fundamentally non-understandable. All these complex formulas are bunk because what's going on inside is fundamentally not understandable. It's also not immediate. So what does that mean for us when we look at the three schools? The Austrians have it right, because the London School and the Chicago School are all about controlling and managing the economy, and a complex system is non-controllable. The London's and the Chicago School is all about spending and taxing and so on. Why? Because we're going to predict what it's going to do. But a complex system is fundamentally non-predictable, and these complex mathematical models don't mean anything because it's fundamentally non-understandable. But the Austrians, I'm going to ignore that. Well, that's another 2-hour discussion, but there's a lot of high connectivity in the Austrian school. We talk about all people talking and trading and interacting with each other all over the place, freely doing that. And there's no centralized controls. So the Austrians have it right. But what does that tell us in terms of what we need to focus on? What's the practical application? Coming back to this barbecue logic. Well, general guiding principles are: make it personal. Ask questions and tell stories. Again, I don't care if they're a heart, a cross, a flag, or a dollar sign. Make it personal. Austrian economics tells us that the economy is all about individuals. It's about people. It's about people living their lives. It's about human action. So when you talk to someone, make it personal. Ask questions, tell stories, and appeal to common sense. We'll give some examples in a minute. Specific strategies. Again, focus on the individual. The themes of private property and liberty. Focus on behavior and human dignity. Why? Austrian school says free trade. Free trade respects behavior. It's driven by behavior, and it respects the dignity of the individual. I'm not going to try to coerce someone into doing something they don't want to do. It respects the dignity of that individual person. Celebrate the benefits of innovation and creativity. Entrepreneurship is another core of the Austrian school. Entrepreneurship, innovation. Highlight the immoral use of force. The London School and the Chicago School are all about controlling and managing. Well, how do you control and manage? By using the force of government in the Keynesian model, and by using the sanctioned force of the Federal Reserve, sanctioned by government, in the monetarist model. So highlight where that force is being used. Expose the impacts on the forgotten man. I'm assuming everyone in here has read the essay, The Forgotten Man. If you haven't, go out online, Google The Forgotten Man, and read the essay. We won't go into it here. It's unbelievably phenomenal. And expose the illusion of understanding and the absurdity of predicting anything. Now, what does that look like? Oh, and remember to do this. So here's your game plan for barbecue logic, right here. I said at the beginning, we needed to have a checklist, right? We need to have a game plan. The game plan has these guiding principles, these specific strategies, and then just keep in the back of your mind, who is it that I'm talking with? Are they a cross, a flag, a heart? Are they a dollar sign? What's their orientation so that I can adjust what I'm saying to what they say? So example number one, unfair compensation. How many of you have been at a party and someone makes a statement like, oh, executives are paid too much, it's unfair, their employees make so much less than them. Why should the CEO make this much money when the line worker makes this much money down here? So how do you respond to that? How do you make it personal? How do you focus on the individual? How do you focus on behavior? One of the most powerful ways to combat something like this is to make it personal for them. There's a great book, Carabini, I think, wrote it, called Inclined Toward Liberty or Inclined to Liberty. He gives this example in there. He says, so what you're really saying is that you are omniscient. You know what an executive should be paid and what an executive is worth. And you know what the employees is worth and what they should be paid. And so what you're really saying is, I know how much the CEO should be paid, and I will personally throw in jail any CEO who dares to accept a salary or a compensation package more or higher than what I deem is appropriate. When someone makes this statement, that's what they're saying. They're trying to hide behind the royal we. Oh, well, somebody ought to do something about the problem. Make it personal.
The czar does it.
I'm sorry?
The czar does it.
Yes, the czar does it. Exactly. No, make it personal and say, you're really saying that you know how much an executive should be paid. And what's more, you're willing to use the force of government to enforce that. You're willing to throw a CEO in jail who accepts a compensation package greater than what you think is reasonable. So I used this one earlier. Remember my example where I came in and I started talking about the number of FTEs per household and adjusting for level of education and all that stuff, and everybody just kind of glazed over? I talked with a very good friend of mine about June. We were at a barbecue, and he made this statement. And I said, Mike, did you have a job while you were in college? He says, oh, yeah, I did. Did you file as a dependent on your parents' income tax? No, I filed on my own. How much money did you make? Oh, God, I was so poor. I mean, we were eating mac and cheese 6 days a week, and on Fridays or whatever, we saved up and went out and had a beer. And that was all that we could afford. I said, okay. How about when you first got married? His wife's name is Carol. I said, how did you and Carol do right out of college? He says, oh, man, we didn't even have kids for 5 years because we didn't have any idea where our next meal was going to come from. I said, okay, so do you think you were probably in the bottom quintile? Do you think you were in that bottom 20% of income, household incomes in the U.S.? Oh, yeah, without a doubt, absolutely. I said, now, Mike, I know you pretty well. You're getting ready to retire in a couple of years, and you probably hit your peak earning about 4 or 5 years ago. Which quintile were you in then? He stopped and he thought for a minute. He says, well, I don't know. I said, Mike, I know how much money you made. You were in the very top of the 4th quintile, maybe the bottom of the 5th quintile. That's where you were. He says, really? I said, yeah, that's where you were. Keep in mind, Mike, that through your life, you started at the bottom and you rose up to the 4th or 5th quintile, and as you hit retirement, you'll probably come back down to about the upper of the 3rd quintile, bottom of the 4th quintile. That's where you'll just kind of sit for the rest of your life. I said, think of your kids. Think of Josh. He's right out of college. Do you want him to have an earnings potential curve that looks like this, or an earnings potential curve that looks like this? He says, oh no, I want Josh to make all the money he can. I want him to be comfortable. I want him to be able to afford a house. I said, so in other words, you and I can agree to celebrate every time that difference gets bigger and bigger. Because if that gap is this tall, Josh has the capability of earning this much money. And he can be comfortable. And he can support his kids. And he can have a house. And he can buy a car. But if he's going to come out of college and make $30,000 a year, and if we smash that down and make the distribution and the difference is smaller, then if he's making $30,000, maybe he can make $40,000 on a really good day when he's 55 years old. Is he going to own his house? Is he going to own a car? How's he going to support his kids? Because I never thought of it that way. And I said, yeah, I celebrate every time I see those numbers getting bigger because that means opportunity. When you smash that disparity, you destroy opportunity. You drive opportunity out of the system. Now, which argument do you think has more impact on someone? Well, if we have 0.7 FTEs on the list and 2.6 FTEs here and we're adjusting for... No, they glaze over. You can say, you, your family, your life, your kids, your lived experience, your action, your human behavior. That's what makes a difference. That's what has an impact. And we can go on. It's not right that some people should just inherit wealth from their parents and others get it. I mean, we're running out of time, so I won't go into a lot of detail. But, America doesn't make things anymore. I already talked about that one. That's the biggest fallacy in the world. If only we could get rid of those combines, have people out there picking the corn off the stalk, then we'd solve the unemployment problem. So, again, make it personal. Talk about what impact it is on people living their lives. Government should invest in green energy because it will reduce our dependence on foreign oil. How many of you have heard that statement? That is the single biggest lie out there. If we had solar panels covering the state of Kansas, it would make virtually no difference on a single barrel of oil that comes into the United States. Why? Because oil is used for transportation, cars, and gasoline. And solar is electricity. Right now, unless the Chevy Volt gets their batteries fixed, we're not driving cars on electricity. We could generate all the gigawatts in the world, and it's not going to impact how much oil we import. This is the biggest lie in the world. And corollaries, power companies should subsidize anyone who wants to go solar. The guy in my neighborhood was putting up his solar panels, and I said, "You owe me a thank you." He goes, "Huh?" He said, "You should be thanking me. I'm being efficient. I'm putting up solar panels." I said, "No, you should be thanking me. I'm paying for them." IREA ran a study. If as little as 10% of their customers went solar, the company entirely would go bankrupt. They don't have the money. Where's the money come from to pay these subsidies? It comes from the ratepayers. They'd have to run our rates up so high that nobody could afford to heat their home. So anyway, make it personal. How much does it cost you to heat your home? How much does it cost you? How do you live your life? How do your kids live their lives? So think about those kind of principles. Think about making it personal. We don't need to get into esoteric theories. The core principles of Austrian economics: private property, free trade, market pricing. That's all we need. And then think about hearts and crosses and so on and shape your argument. Do like I do. I practice with my wife. I practice with my friends. My friends are about ready to disown me. How many times I call them up and say, "Hey, I got a new idea. What if I answered this problem this way?" Okay. But think about that, because we have got to get better at expressing our ideas, not just to like-minded people who think analytically, but to people who think with their hearts, who think with the flag, who everything is right and wrong, and those who orient themselves from a religious perspective. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Couple announcements, and then we have time for maybe just one or two questions. We're running a little late here. We do have, for those of you who do not know, we have material over here that is free to you. The only stipulation upon that is that when you're done with it, you give it to someone else to read. Otherwise, feel free to have some more of the refreshments in the back. If you would like to donate, we would appreciate that because the food does not come free either. This is maybe ask about 2 questions. Anybody have any burning questions here? Yes.
What conversation do you have with that household that has 0.7 FTEs and they have everybody else paying for them? You know, so if you have, a 2.4 or 2.6 FTE household that is paying for that 0.7 household, that 0.7 household isn't going to want to increase their productivity to lose their income. Does that make sense?
Yes, but they are and they aren't. What I want us to focus on here is one of the comments I made is we need to focus on human dignity. And my youngest, when she first moved out of the house, she was actually in that bottom quintile, and she was in one of those 0.7 kind of households. And when I spoke with her about it, it was a lot talking about the dignity of being able to provide for yourself and help for yourself. And they go, oh, but I need a job to do that. One of my best friends is a deacon at, I think it's Faith, or New Hope Presbyterian in Castle Rock. One of the comments he made to me was, I have never interviewed for a job in my entire life. What I've done in my entire life is I see something that needs to be done and I start doing it. And if what I'm doing actually is valuable and somebody values it, I end up getting paid for it. So the comment I made to my youngest was, don't wait for someone to give you a job, and stand up for yourself and stand up for your dignity. And she went out and she said, I wonder if people want their dogs washed. And she went next door and she said, I'll wash your dogs. And they said, great. And she washed their 2 dogs. And they said, what do we owe you? And she says, nothing. They said, no, we really want to pay you. She said, pay me by recommending me to your friends. And literally within about 3 months, she had about 25 people that she was washing their dogs for. It was almost a full-time job, and she was making about $30,000 a year. So find something to do. And don't worry about somebody giving you a job. Don't worry about, oh, I can't do anything because somebody has to give me a job. No, they don't. You're a human being. God put you on this planet to do something. You're here to be active. You're here to produce. Go do something, and if it's valuable, the rest will take care of itself. So talk about dignity and talk about not standing back and waiting for something to happen. We got to live life proactively. If we sit back and wait, we'll spend our life on the bench, and then on our deathbed we'll go, gee, I wonder what if. But if we're active, if we go out there and drive and pursue and do something, that makes all the difference in the world. And by the way, she did this with 2 young kids. So it wasn't that she had all this free time in the world.
One more question.
I'd like to recommend the book The Hunger Games. It is going to be a movie, 23rd of March, which happens to be the anniversary of Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death speech. The plot is a young girl learns skills outside of school, and she takes those skills and is forced into a game. It's called a game, but she is supposed to kill 23 other people so that the survivor gets fed extra rations in a completely socialistic world. But the book itself describes what she does with those skills, how she makes a living for herself and supports her family. So it talks about a free market as a black market. And it also describes the terror and terrible things of a centralized government giving you what they think you need and controlling what you get. So, and most children have read it. It's put out by Scholastic, the same people who put out Harry Potter. And there's over 4 million copies of those books out there. So, and a lot of people have read them, mostly young people. So you can use examples like, so-and-so wants to control everything like President Snow instead of trying to explain Stalin or Marx or Lenin to somebody whose face will glaze over.
Exactly.
I highly recommend the book
What's the name of
series.
the book again?
The Hunger Games. You can, if you can type it in there, you can probably see the, whatchamacallit. See,
The other piece on that, and pulling on that, is that the folks at Vanguard are privileged to have a school that actually teaches free market economics and actually talks about, unlike that video that we watched to kick this off, actually has talked about people like Adam Smith and so on. But recognize that most of the public school system does not. And so we here need to get involved in the school systems, whether it's at the school board, whether it's at the school district, whether it's going and sitting in your kid's classroom, whether it's talking to the principal. We need to make sure that because teachers, by the way, most teachers I've run into, we tend to put them in this lump that says, oh, they're all liberals and they're all socialists. The reality is that they're pragmatists. They'll teach whatever somebody's developed a lesson plan for them to teach, so that they don't have to develop it on their own. The way the liberals have taken over the public school system is they developed all the curriculums and all the tools and all. Here's what you do on day 1. Here's what you do on day 2. Here's what you do on day 3. You want to have an impact, get together with a group of people and start to put together a curriculum and then take it into the teachers. Teachers will teach it. Most of them are not ideologically opposed to free markets. What they're ideologically or fundamentally opposed to is having to develop their own curriculum. So, anyway.